Hey everyone. So I've been playing around with some Nintex workflow user-defined actions that I want to build out, and it all stemmed from something my wife said to me, which is, have you ever used something called Wunderlist? And I haven't, right? So I'm guessing a lot of you probably have already used this or seen this before, and I'm way behind the curve here, but it's pretty cool. It gives me the ability to create a bunch of lists, and the really cool thing is, well, sorry, and tasks in those lists. But really cool thing is that it actually lets me, uh, I guess, collaborate with my wife, which is kind of cool. So we can have like a groceries list, so we know what we have to go and get when we go to the grocery store. So it's pretty nifty. Now, of course, being the nerd that I am, I thought I need to see what can I do with this with Nintex, right? Because that makes a lot of sense, right? Can I automate some stuff? So I started looking around, and funnily enough, I actually came across this site, which is the developer.wunderlist.com, or is it Wunderlist? I'm not really sure. Now, once you create yourself an account, the really cool thing is all you need to do is register an app. So you need to do things like, provide uh, a name, a description, an icon, and then a couple of URLs. Now, I haven't seen anywhere where the URL is actually being used. For me, I'm not using the auth callback, uh, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Uh, but it's pretty easy. Once I've done this, it creates me a couple of things: a client ID, a secret, and then eventually an access token that I can use. Now, I'm going to jump into the next tab here, and this is one of the developer pages around the task object. So you can see there's a bunch of endpoints that you can use, and it's all using REST calls. So a bunch of JSON data being sent. So it's kind of cool. The documentation is actually pretty decent. The one thing I do want to point out when you do make these calls is just have a look at what the difference is between what the actual call takes. So for example, some things take parameters, which is the things you add to the end of the URL, and then some things will actually have, let's actually jump into the list endpoint, actual JSON data that you put together. So let's see if we have right there. So rather than parameters, it has data. So you actually put together a JSON packet. So pretty cool. Of course, as soon as I looked at this, I thought, yep, this is perfect. I'm going to be able to make these calls through Nintex workflow. So let's have a look how we did this. Jump into the authorization part. You'll see there is a couple of headers you'll need to put into any sort of calls that you make. There's the access token and the client ID. Right? Now you get these when you actually register your app. Uh, the one thing I want to point out is that this is going to be different for everybody unless you actually build a proper app that exposes sort of functionality where you do the OAuth callbacks and things like that. I'm not doing that. I've got my access token and I'm just using that. So for the user-defined actions that I've built so far, you would need to kind of go through the registration process, get your own client ID, your own secret, and your own access token. And I've made it a little bit easier for you to be able to use those, which is through the UDA, so it should be pretty cool that way. I'm not doing any of this stuff. So you see here it says redirect the users to request Wunderlist access. I'm not doing any of that, mainly because I am building workflow user-defined actions. So there's not going to be a user interface behind there. All I want is the workflow to be able to run these actions and talk to Wunderlist. All right, let's have a look at how we do this. So first of all, I'm going to jump into here. This is just a list that I created in SharePoint 2013. And I built a couple of test workflows just to test my user-defined actions. Now, once you go into site settings and you go over here into manage workflow constants, you'll see I have a bunch of constants that I use, but here are my Wunderlist access token, my client ID, and my secret. So they're all called Wunderlist, Wunderlist secret, Wunderlist access token, and Wunderlist client ID. Now, the reason why I did this is because I want to centralize those values so that I don't have to keep, making changes to the actual actions themselves. So if you want to use the user-defined actions that I've created, simply create the workflow constants that you see here, give them the values from your registration from Wunderlist development, and the user-defined actions should just work. So let's have a look at what the actual actions look like. Let's see, let's jump over here. Now, okay, that's the workflow, so I don't really want that. Let's go into manage user-defined actions. So I have a bunch in here, but if you look at all these user-defined actions that I've created so far, create a note and reminder, delete a list, delete reminder, delete task, get a list, get reminder, get task, and update notes and reminders. So I've made, let's see what we've got here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'll probably make some more. I'll probably make one that's create list if there's an API for it, yeah, and maybe update list or something like that. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of these just to give you an idea of what I've actually done. So let's jump over here. Okay, this is the update reminder user-defined action. Now, this user-defined action, what we're doing is we're updating an existing reminder. So if I go into my parameters, I see I have 3 input parameters. I have the list name, the reminder date, and the task name. So basically, I want to find a particular task in a particular list, and I want to update the reminder on it. Right? If I jump back into here and go to reminders, and this should be, I'm going to scroll down, so excuse me for jumping around all over the place, but you can see we have update a reminder. We're doing a patch call. Here's the URL. One thing to point out, notice this colon ID. This is the ID of the reminder that you want to update. You do not need the colon. So once you have the ID, just replace those 3 characters with the actual ID. And then the data, which is the JSON packet that you see over here, it needs the ID, it needs the date, and it also needs the revision because you can have multiple reminders or reminders change, so you need that value as well. Again, notice this is what they say for the request body example. You don't need the JSON bit at the beginning. I did not need that. I don't use that in any of my REST calls. So just a little note about that, just in case you get any sort of bad request responses and things like that. All right, so let's have a look at this one, which is the update reminder. So I've got my parameters. Now you'll notice this is not really the type of workflow I generally build. It's very, very kind of top down, right? So you can see here, I'm calculating a date. Now I'm passing a date into this user-defined action, but what I need is the ISO, I can't remember the code for it. Here we go, the ISO 8601. That's the format that it expects. So all I'm doing is taking that parameter. I'm not making any changes to it. I'm storing it back into that parameter because it's a required field, and I'm storing the ISO 8601 date string in a variable that I'm going to use in my web service call or my web request. Now, since I'm passing in a list name and a task name, I need to actually find the reminder that I'm actually interested in. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm making a web request call. I'm calling the Wunderlist lists REST service. And if I open up the headers here you can see there's my token, there's my client ID, and I've inserted those constants that I mentioned earlier. So pretty cool, makes it really easy. Again, like I said, I'll be able to share these UDAs with you. So in order for you to use them without having to make real changes to the actions themselves, just create the constants with these values, and I'll put the actual, the correct text in the blog post. I store the result back. I get a bunch of JSON data, and I know that a lot of you have already done a lot of work with JSON and realized that there's no simple parsing of data in Nintex workflow. I know it's something that the team's looking into, so we are aware of that. But in the meantime, you can do things like regular expressions, and you can build some pretty elaborate regular expressions to get the data that you want out. So in this case, here's my pattern. What I'm actually doing is just checking that the list that I passed to my UDA actually does exist. So that works. Cool. Check match, and I'm storing it in a Boolean. If it does exist, this is what this set of condition is for. I'm doing another regular expression. This time I'm actually getting the ID. Now, I have a blog post all around getting data, getting text between other pieces of text using regular expressions. So I'm basically using a query like I think it's a look ahead, look behind. I keep forgetting, getting those mixed up. I think it's a look ahead. So I'm basically getting text between the ID piece of text and the title and the list name. So I'm getting the correct ID for that list. I'm going to skip through the rest of the bits because basically this is just all just pulling that data out. Finally, we want to find the appropriate tasks. So I'm going to be doing exactly the same thing, except this time I'm calling the tasks REST service and passing in the list ID. Right now, this is if I go back to the documentation and I look at tasks, you'll see I have get tasks for a list. So here's my task. List ID is a parameter, so it's a parameter you put on the query string at the end of that URL, and I'm passing in the actual list ID that I got earlier. Again, you'll notice headers, all that information is there, which I've hard coded, so I need to fix that. Oops. Okay. Again, pulling out the information, and then finally, down here, I want to find the reminder. So you'll probably find it looks very similar to the previous calls. Reminders, you'll see it'll have task ID, all that sort of stuff. Did I hard code it? No, I haven't. Okay, perfect. And then finally, after doing all this work, we are actually calling the update reminder REST service. So here's the reminder ID, and here's the JSON data so you can see the date. I've got my variable, which is in that ISO 8601 format, and the text, the actual revision. And this is the revision that we pulled out previously in this user-defined action. So you see, this is not the normal kind of workflow that I build, right? I'm not a big fan of just having workflows that do kind of like a top-down waterfall type design. So what I'll do is actually go into another user-defined action. This is the get reminder, right? Now, this is going to be an interesting one. You'll notice I used a state machine because what I'm doing is just trying to make this workflow a little bit nicer and a little bit more robust, right? So let's have a look at what we're actually passing in. So what this is meant to give us back, and you'll just look at the output variables for now, is the ID of the reminder and the revision. Because then later on, I'll be able to actually make a call to the update reminder user-defined action and actually pass this in so it doesn't have to go and find lists and tasks and figure out what the ID is and figure out what the reminder revision is, all that sort of stuff. This is a user-defined action that's going to find that for me. Now, I'm actually passing in 4 different pieces of information. I have my list ID and my list name. I have my task ID and my task name. None of these input parameters are required, but for the list ones, you should have at least either the ID or the name. And for the task, you should have the ID or the name. Now, come down here into this workflow, it goes into the init state first. And what we're doing here is we're actually checking, is the ID, and this should actually be that one, is the ID not empty, right? Is the list ID not empty? Let's actually publish this before I forget. Now, if it's not empty, we have a list ID, right? Which means we can now go to get a task ID. But if we don't have a list ID that's been passed in, but instead we've had a list name passed in, then we're going to jump to the get list ID state. So this is where we're actually going to talk to Wunderlist and actually say, find me all the lists. Now find me a list with this particular name and then pull out the list ID, right? That's basically what all this is doing. Making the query, checking to make sure that list exists. And if it does exist, pull out the ID. And now we're going to jump to the get task ID. So I'm basically covering both scenarios. If this is the first time you're calling a workflow, this user-defined action, you probably don't have the ID of that list. You just have the name, right? So this will find the ID. If you've gotten the ID, then you can just pass the ID in and not worry about the name, and that's going to make your workflow a lot faster because it's not going to have to re-query things again and again. All right, so let's say we have the ID. We jump to the get task ID. Again, we could have already passed in a task ID. Again, I need to tweak this because this is not quite right. There we go, reminder ID. And if we have the reminder ID, then, the task ID, Oops, did I put in? I put in the wrong thing. My apologies. Task ID. Then since we already have the task ID and we have the list ID, let's jump to the get reminder ID, and that's where we're going to find that information. Otherwise, again, talk to Wunderlist, find out the tasks, find that specific task, and actually get that task ID, and then we come down here and we say change state to get reminder ID. All right. And then finally, we're making that web service call to the reminders saying, give me information about the reminder for this specific task. Right? Again, you'll see all the headers are always the same. So although this is a fairly elaborate user-defined action, the reason behind it is that I'm catering for two different scenarios. You know, when somebody passes me a user-defined action, passes me a list ID, or they just pass me a list name, or they pass me a task ID, or they pass me a task name. I'm just catering for both, all in one super duper user-defined action. So pretty easy, right? I mean, I guess it's a little complex, but like I said, it's just to cover, multiple scenarios. Now, if I look at my workflow, here's my workflow that uses the get reminder UDA. So again, I'm going to pop this open, and you'll see the input parameters, those four, and the output parameters. So very cool. So you can see here, I'm not actually passing any IDs. I'm just passing in I need to look at dummy list, and I need to look at the first task. So if I look at over here, here's my dummy list, and here's my first task, right? So I have that there. And then once I have the reminder ID and the revision, I can come down here and call delete reminder UDA, and just pass in those two parameters that are required. And now my other UDA will go off and delete that particular reminder. So pretty nifty, right? Like I said, if I go back to over here, I created 10. I might make a couple more before I put these out on the blog post. But one of the things that I really want you to sort of take away from this is that you can build these UDAs yourself, right? This might be total overkill for you. You may not need this. You know, this might be the type of design that you want. I have not renamed any of these actions, and you definitely should, because especially if you come down here, you can see it gets a little complex, and there's seems to be things that are a little repetitive, right? Web request, set a condition, set a condition. There's just certain things you just won't be able to genericize, I guess, make it generic. So just be aware of that. But I've made this one, this type of UDA. I did not like the design. I wanted to make it a bit more robust. So I made this one, and it's a little bit more powerful. So I kind of like that. Uh, Hopefully this is helpful for you guys. I think Wunderlist is kind of cool to use, but the fact that I can start automating that, it's pretty awesome. So the last thing that I would want to do if I was doing this for a production environment is actually go in here. Let's go to one of these actions. Go into the settings and actually change the icon and actually create custom icons. So in this case, I would do something like have the Wunderlist icon, which you can, let's see if I can see anyway. Yeah, right there. So I'd do something like that, and then maybe have like an Nintex X in there, just so you can differentiate it and say this is the specifically for Nintex. That's about all I would do. Other than that, hopefully these are pretty handy for anybody who wants to start automating some of this, having some collaboration, having some tasks that are potentially outside of SharePoint, and sending some reminders, all that sort of stuff. If you guys have any questions, definitely reach out, but hopefully I'll be able to have a bunch of these new user-defined actions available to you, and you can find them on my blog, and also there'll be a link on the Nintex Exchange. So I hope you guys have a good day, and thanks for listening in.